negligence assignment as part of assignment 2. So just follow through what's in the actual assignment. So what you're required to do here is work through the 4 steps of negligence, which is set out one after the other here: the duty of care, then the standard of care and breach, causation, remoteness. So these steps simply follow the main criteria which are in the course notes. So let's just start with the duty of care. What you're doing here is identifying persons who are owed a duty of care by your business using an activity related to your product or service that you or an employee would carry out in the business. Now, what you're required to do here is outline the test to be applied in the duty of care, and it's the same in all these 4 steps. So you need to find that test off the notes. The tests are straightforward, but set them out as well as your facts. And the core part of this is to apply it and identify persons. So here you're identifying 2 persons who the duty may be owed to. Now, turning to the example I've been using in these videos, my business was the sleep out and installation with plumbing and fittings, people's houses with transport and delivery. So that's one of the sleep outs, and that's my truck for delivery. So when I'm doing this, who can I reasonably foresee I might affect as I go through the steps? So on the assignment table, which you need to use, here we're setting out the test of reasonable foreseeability. I won't fill this in, this is part of the assignment, so set the test out as you see it. This is the test of owing a duty to people who are reasonably foreseeable from the activity you're carrying out. So you need to identify the activity and simply ask that question. So a simple statement here of what the activity is. So I'm installing the sleep outs on the premises of the client, and I'll be doing toilet and electrical supplies. So if you follow through on those, who can I reasonably foresee? Well, electrical installations. Who could I affect by playing with the power supply? Clearly any other power users. If I somehow manage to interrupt power supplies, I could foresee the neighbors of the client. Now clearly I can foresee my own client, but that's a contractual relationship, and we are more interested in people outside the contract. So if I install incorrectly and burn down my client's house, they can probably sue me in breach of contract. But potentially the bank who lent them the money from the house could sue me for negligence. So what am I doing? I'm delivering the sleep outs, so I might owe the council a duty of care in relation to the footpath. Moving down through here, I'm unloading the sleep out using a crane, so people passing by, I could damage things such as the power supply. Connecting the toilet, I could foresee other users of the sewer system, stormwater and drinking systems, councils, neighbours and other persons. So it could be a lot of expense involved with any of those. Now, one thing about this step is I'm not actually concerned about any damage. What have I actually done doesn't matter at this point. We're simply asking the general question of who do we owe a duty of care to. So before anything goes wrong, you're simply thinking here, who could possibly sue me because of this business activity? Okay, so now going back to the assignment, the second step here is the standard of care and breach. So the standard of care is simply asking how careful do you have to be while carrying out this activity. And here we use an objective test of saying who the reasonable person who you would expect to carry out this activity is. And that's going to be a moving target depending on the activity. So a reasonable truck driver would be qualified and experienced. A reasonable doctor would be far more qualified in terms of medicine and potentially experienced as well. So you're going to have to say, who do I expect in normal circumstances to carry out this activity? So in my case, that's a company that installs sleep outs, builds them properly, knows what they're doing in driving, delivering. If we're going to undertake electrical work, then the reasonable person is a qualified electrician. If I'm undertaking the plumbing and sanitation work, that's a qualified plumber and drain layer with the current knowledge and experience you would expect for that. And so how do I breach that? By simply not meeting those standards. So what am I going to do to breach this as my examples? Well, I've got a truck. I can drive the truck across the curb and I could do it some damage. I should not have taken my truck across that curb. I should have realized the truck was too heavy for it, and an experienced driver would have this knowledge. So I have breached the standard of care and I owe that duty to the council. If I'm using a crane, then I'm going to have the potential issues to do with power lines, anything overhead. So here I've got a small problem of the crane is hitting the power lines, which is going to do a lot of damage and potentially affect everybody on the street. So in the second part of this, once again, the test, the reasonable person carrying out the activity, and here saying define the reasonable person. So don't just write what I've written. You need to say what the activity is specifically, who the person you should expect to carry out that activity is. That is the reasonable person. So as said before, electricity supply, current knowledge, delivery would be a driver with knowledge for crossing the footpath. Sanitation, that will be, for example, the plumber. Note the instructions in the assignment as to how many you need. This is more than you actually need. Have I breached these duties of care in the examples from those pictures? Well, certainly I have. The question is, have I failed to meet the standards? Well, putting the wrong size wire, for example, electrically, not burying deep enough, not following the regulations, any of these things will be a breach of the duty of care, because that's what a good electrician would do properly. Crossing the footpath with too much weight, well, that's a well-known issue to experienced truck drivers. And hitting the power lines, well, clearly a breach, as any reasonable driver or operator of a crane would of course check height clearances. And the sanitation water, again, that's a drainage issue. So I could easily have all of these breaches in my example. Now, the next thing we're going to move on to is causation. So again, you need to identify when the breach of standard would or could result in a cause of loss and to who. So causation is simply saying, did the breach cause a loss? So if I hit the power lines with my crane, as in here, what would happen if I simply touched these wires, there was a big spark, but nobody's power was cut off? Then of course I've been negligent, but I haven't caused anybody a loss, so they can't actually sue me. So in your assignment, you need to set out the outline of the test to be applied. And again, this is in the notes. This is the real and effective cause of the loss. In most circumstances, this will be very obvious. You make a mistake in your business and somebody's damaged because of it, and that's directly related to what you did. The problem arises when there are two different persons who each contribute to a loss, and we don't normally have that situation in most business examples. But let's say, for example, in my test here with the crane, so I've managed to hit the power lines with my crane. Now, on the face of it, that's negligence of the operator. But what if the hydraulics on that crane, which are running down here, so it's got all these hydraulic lines, there'll be some levers and such at the bottom for the driver to control it with, and one of those jams because the mechanics who worked on it didn't fix it properly. Now, those mechanics have been negligent in the repair of my crane, and I've been negligent in the use of my crane. So who actually caused the loss? Now, clearly, if the mechanics had not been negligent, I would have stopped the crane. But equally, I should not have been operating that close to the power lines, so I'm also negligent. So in this circumstance, we would say that both persons who have been negligent can be sued, and each has been a cause of the loss. Well, the legal test is a real and effective cause of the loss, which means we can sue more than one person for negligence for a single loss. In terms of your assignment, it's quite acceptable to stay with one person being negligent and causing a loss, but you should be aware that it is possible to sue more than one person if more than one person has caused a loss you suffer, as for example with my crane driver being too close to the power lines and the mechanics not fixing the hydraulic lines properly. Both of them are at fault. So what am I putting in the table here? Causation, set out the test fully, a little bit more fully than I have, and then turn to the losses. So you're giving examples here of facts of loss. So my examples there, I've hit the power lines, and so it's turned off to local houses and factories that cannot make their product and lose money from sales. The damage to the footpath, so the council's got to repair the footpath. It's difficult to see any further losses than that. Perhaps somebody's riding a bike and damages their bike because of the damage. Sanitation and water is a tricky example, but if I connect up the sanitation of the system to the stormwater, for example, that's going to cause the council problems in terms of filtration and issues with people getting sick. However, that's a more difficult example, so I'd suggest you stay with the more straightforward physical losses. Okay, now where we go from here is through to the next step, which is remote. Now the problem with this is I've hit the power lines, I've cut the power off to a factory, and the factory's not been able to produce its product, and because of that they don't supply their customers, and their customers cannot supply their customers, and so they lose money and they can't pay the bank back, and the bank loses money. So what I've done has caused a series of events like dominoes, which is just continually causing more and more people losses. Now, I cannot be liable for every single loss that flows from any event. Otherwise, if I was to hit a fire hydrant, for example, the water would come out of it, it might flood shops, that's foreseeable. It might cause a fire within the shops, the fire might spread, it might get to some oil tankers, and it might blow up half of Auckland. Clearly, I cannot be liable for all of those losses. So the question is, what losses am I liable for that my negligence is a cause of? And to answer that question, we use the fourth step, which is remoteness. And the test of remoteness is to simply say, is the actual loss that occurred a kind of loss which was foreseeable? So if I start a fire, then fire losses are foreseeable. So if the fire results in an explosion, explosions are of the same kind. Or in the example in class where I spill diesel fuel in the harbour and there is a fire resulting, the argument there is diesel fuel is not easy to ignite. It doesn't burn very easily, so the kind of loss expected is pollution. It's not fire, so fire losses are too remote. So in this step, what you're going to be saying is, and applying a brief test down here, is to say what kind of losses are foreseeable from what I did. So when I cut off the power, then losses through a loss of electricity are clearly foreseeable. So therefore the factory losses are foreseeable, but the loss of income to the factory's clients is not. We would say it is too remote, and therefore they can't sue me successfully for that loss. Okay, so going back to the form here, let's put down the test at the top. Kind of losses, failure of power or surges in power. So anything that causes fires, explosions, it's foreseeable. Those using the power will suffer loss. The delivery issues, it's only physical damage that's foreseeable by trucks. So if somebody is riding their bike, hits the pothole and falls off their bike and damages their watch, that is not reasonably foreseeable, therefore it's too remote. Okay, now those are the 4 steps, and the last step we want to look at is vicarious liability. Now, what do we mean by vicarious liability? It's simply asking the question, am I liable for the actions of other people who are negligent? And the answer is yes, if you control them. And in some circumstances, such as partnership, the law says you are liable for the negligence of your partners. So the task here is to apply the law of vicarious liability to your business and identify persons whose negligent actions could result in liability for you, and provide one example where the negligence person would not result in liability. So if I turn once again to my crane heading the power lines, if I employ a contractor, directly employ them, or a apprentice who's undertaken this action, then I am vicariously liable because I control their actions. But what if the apprentice came back after work and started playing with the crane and did this? Then that would be outside of my control and I would not be vicariously liable. It's the same issue where I send the apprentice off to pick up some equipment for our job, some nails or other building equipment, and the apprentice crashes the work vehicle on the way to the supply. I would be, as the employer, vicariously liable for the damage the apprentice causes. But if it's lunchtime and the apprentice decides to go for a drive and get some fish and chips and does exactly the same thing, that's outside of my control, and therefore I'm not vicariously liable. So here you simply need to set out what the test is, look at things like your employees. Everybody's going to have the option of employees. You can give examples there. An example where I'm not liable, for example, for my case study is, let's consider if I used a registered electrician or plumber who are not my employee or partner. And again, I don't control them and I'm not liable for the negligent actions. So one way to avoid negligence actions is to actually employ independent contractors who are qualified. However, if you employed people you knew were not properly qualified, you would still be liable because that in itself would be negligent. Okay, and today we're just going to finish off with a picture of a lion.